Welcome to the Leading Movement Health Series. I'm your host, Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. And today's guest, I'm really excited, Andy Walshe. Andy's got over 2 decades of experience in elite human performance, starting in Australia. Sometimes when I talk about him with others, he's kind of the OG of sports science, if you will. And one of his passions is demystifying talent. And he works with world-class programs across military, sports, Fortune 500 companies, performing arts, and now he works at Liminal Collective, where he's the founding member, which is a community that's working to enable humanity's greatest endeavors. And we too often minimize human performance to elite athletes or just to physical training. But a lot of leadership is adapting to a diverse personalities, diverse situations. And why I'm excited to have Andy is Andy's experience in human performance is probably the most broad and robust that you'll come across. So I'm excited to have Andy, and thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you, Phil. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And so, Andy, talk a little bit just at a high level. Why is performance important just to organizations and not just the traditional elite sport, elite military?
From an organizational perspective, I think the recognition is growing. I think people are already seeing post-COVID and what the sort of humans experienced through that sort of time frame. This notion that the sort of human capital in the organization is really important, but it's more than just how well are they doing their job. I think the realization is that what's happening outside of their workplace, what's happening outside of the role they may have in the organization, it impacts how well they can affect their job. And again, I think most people knew this at a sort of core level, but it was sort of exposed. And I think as we saw the ramifications of the experiences of people going through this sort of global threat, if you like, it was sort of more on the table with respect to how do we actually help people thrive and flourish outside of the workplace so that they can bring their best selves to the workplace. And I think that's an underpinning that sort of triggered a lot of the conversations we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I love the terms you're using in there, thrive, right? And because a lot of times human capital can be perceived as almost, a crass labeling of the value of humans, right? But we're talking about human capital, we're talking about the potential, right? The thriving and not just showing up, doing your job, punching a time clock, because what you do outside of work impacts work, right? It's not, it's not these two split personalities.
No, and I think, the models we've learned from all the communities over the years is you sort of got to figure out yourself and what you stand for, what's important to you and where you are in your life and the context and everything else that plays into it. And sort of the idea that sort of better at yourself and better at who you are allows you to be better at what you do across any domain of performance. And I think, human capital could be a line on a spreadsheet, but even if you look at it that crassly or mercenarily, it's a big number for most organizations. It's a significant line item, and so let's get past the notion of trying to minimize days off and minimize healthcare costs. And what are you doing in your organization to really give that talent an opportunity to bring their best work forward and do what, reach their potential. And if you think about that narrative, it's a very different model, I think, in the mindset of an organization versus, minimizing costs, and I think sometimes we all want to do the former, but it's challenging, when P&Ls are due and quarterly statements are due to sort of get past the bottom line, if you like.
Yeah, and I recently saw you at the Special Operations Forces Week, SOF Week, and one of the panels you were on, we're talking about, identifying talent, right? How do we identify that for organizations? What's a big kind of takeaway or thing that you like to emphasize for organizations when you think about identifying and developing talent?
I think one of the great lessons we learned, and this was driven early on in my career from the government programs and those communities you mentioned, it was this idea that, you can train pretty much people to do anything, within context. But it's the character, it's the core human values they bring to the table that are really the things that are most critical. And the best programs in the world tend to select heavily on character, and then look at the skill set as something that is then trainable. And I've really come to adopt that in my own sort of frameworks over the years, because I've seen it in action. I've seen it sort of, if you really do put the right people around you in the right way with the right vision and purpose and the right character set, then they can achieve extraordinary things. And the technical side of what they can achieve becomes more of a operational exercise. It's very hard to change the character framework through training, as opposed to the tactical element. So I think that's been, to me, one of the things that when we get stuck on talent selection, it's kind of who do you want next to you? Who's that person that really lives up to your values and constructs?
Yeah, a lot of times, right? There's, at least Google talks about, if you're going to be stuck in an airport, who do you want to be stuck in the airport with? On a layover for a long period of time. Yeah, so it seems what you're talking about, the organization themselves defining their own values first is really a big piece to identifying the talent, because you're looking for the character, the value set that matches and meshes with what you believe in.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best exercises as an organization you can do. So I think the values and ethos of an organization is one of the most important conversations you should be having. And I think there's lots of reasons why. I think the tactics of it are that it needs to be done in order to establish what you really want to stand for, what potentially your legacy may be. It'll define your behaviors. It'll also impact decision-making. And it'll help streamline and speed up your decision-making process if everyone's aligned on those sort of not negotiables you have. What I think is really important is to reconsider the idea that they're sort of done 100 years ago by the founders of the company, and they're set in stone. I think the notion is that you've got to revisit them pretty regularly nowadays. And again, not to dwell on the point, but even post-COVID, I think a lot of organizations inherently reimagined their value set because they recognized that there was a different framework in which they could operate and their people wanted to operate. And in the current hybrid work environment, whatever that means to you, that's something that sort of needs addressing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As I listen to you too, when you talk about character and values, how do you kind of marry that with another one of your passions, which is creativity, right? Because sometimes I think it might be easy to think, okay, here's our organization, here's our values, we're going to hire people with those. And it's easy to think, okay, you're just filling slots, right, on the team. So how do you kind of balance, that, creativity for human performance with, matching up with values?
Well, it's funny, you sort of, you bring it to the table. I think a lot of organizations have things like innovation or thought leadership, or they have values statements that speak to the inherent notion of creativity. And I think, the easy way for us to sort of ratify it in a group is to, creativity, essentially means in the organizational setting, competitive advantage. You reframe how you're currently doing a particular process in your org, or reimagine that process to make it more efficient, cost saving. Reimagine the products that you're going to deliver. What's the next gen? So the internal disruption argument. That gives you value or new opportunities in the marketplace. So I think the real notion of creativity is, in its essence, is the notion that you're empowering your staff to. And encouraging your staff in cases to think, ahead of the curve and what's next and beyond what's sort of status quo. And I think now more than ever, given the chaotic, ambiguous, and sort of challenging world we're living in and moving into, and the disruption caused by the generative AIs and all the other arguments out there, it's inherent, and I think even more of a responsibility than ever to start to foster that thinking, because I think there's a future here coming very quickly where that skill set is going to be in greater demand than it ever has been.
Yeah. And I think when you think about these aspects of creativity and values, how does that kind of wrap in with the physical health, right, of organizations? Do they play off each other? Does one have more of an impact overall in an organization's performance?
Let these birds fly past. God, I'm getting hammered today. I think in terms of physical performance, and I don't differentiate them per se. I think they're all part of the holistic human. I think that the future of human performance is fastly becoming this integrated snapshot versus this isolated determination of sub factors. But I really think, if you're not sleeping well, let's get down to basics. Yeah. It's very hard to wake up in the morning and bring your most creative self to work, and vice versa. In your hierarchy of needs, if your physicality is sort of, you're not in great health, then you're going to have other priorities to deal with. And I think they're not necessarily exclusive, but I think they definitely, in many cases, are supporting of each other. And I think that's the way to think about this stuff. I mean, people who've heard me speak, the complexity of the human is so beyond our comprehension. And we still are such in an early stage of understanding how the thing operates, the human entity operates, that you got to think of this whole package. And it's hard because that becomes challenging in terms of metrics and KPIs and all the rest of it. But I also think you lose sight of the beauty of the whole package if you do try and isolate it out. So I think interdependency is probably the key marker of a human condition, and there's no way to separate them out, as much as we'd like to.
Yeah, are there certain organizational, almost case studies? You don't necessarily need to share names or things like that, where you've seen hey, they got it right, trying to balance all these complexities of the human, or at least or getting it right. It's certainly not a true false question, but are taking strides that you feel hey, these are some things that they're doing that we're really seeing this level of performance creatively, physically start to rise.
I think you see great examples in the industry where if they really want to focus on the creative elements, they have passed out room for that. They've given space to that. And I think the organizations who do a good job with it do make it a priority. And of course, you've got the artistic organizations and those sorts of frameworks that people default to. But even in the highly technology focused events, like and they wouldn't mind me mentioning it, but my time spent sort of in the advisory group at DARPA, it was a highly creative organization, and everything screams bureaucracy about a government agency, but they've inculcated a value set around really bleeding edge ideation. And I think importantly, they've set up structures and systems and expectations to match it. So everybody will know that one of the greatest sort of killers of creativity is expectation of accuracy and 100% efficacy of the outcome. If you have to guarantee something's going to work, and you're going to crush a lot of the creative conversation, because people are going to default to things that they already work. And places like the DARPAs of the world have over 90% failure rate, and that's expected. And that's just a simple way of saying, okay, I'm free to come up with a crazy idea. I'm even free to test a crazy idea. And it's not like if the idea wins or loses or fails or succeeds, it is the metric. It's that even if we do make mistakes and the idea doesn't result in the outcome we wanted, the win, there's so much to be learned from that process and pushing up against that. There's the benefit of the unexpected outcomes. So if you treat that model in that way, you've given yourself room to explore. And that's, again, as an organization, as a leader in an organization, you have the luxury of mitigating that risk across your organization. You don't have to have every part of your organization, playing in the 5% success rate. It just doesn't work.
Right.
You got to deliver a product. You have to deliver a service. You have to, there's things you have to get done. But if that part of the organization is focused on that, 100% or close to expectation, that leaves you room over here in another part of the organization to maybe have some opportunities to lower that outcome expectation and focus more on the process expectation, which, that's the beauty of being the boss. You can balance and sort of mitigate the risk across the organization, if you like, by balancing out different entities and different approaches within different parts of the organization.
Yeah, you probably don't want the accountants and the financials having a 90% failure rate, right?
No, we often joke, you don't want your accounting team taking the quarterly profits and running to Vegas and putting it on black. That's probably
yeah, right.
The shareholders might have something to say. But even in the accounting group or the financial group, there is opportunity to innovate in process and systems and approaches and the teams. So it's not just the special creative group that sits over like a skunk works at Lockheed, which are targeted to think right out on the edge and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, because that is obviously one system that works. But the other side of the coin is it doesn't mean it's just they're the only groups in the organization who can exercise creative expression. The frameworks that you put in place for the application are going to be different. You want everyone's inherently creative, and humans will naturally try and figure out a better way to do things for the most part. You just got to then determine whether that process actually, the risk to the organization is offset by the opportunities. And that's what basically leaders do every day across the board.
Yeah, identifying those pockets where creativity does, have an impact with, minimal risk to the whole, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and they may come up with a new idea that really changes. I think Amazon quote, the cloud platform that they built and the moneymaker they have, as I understood it, was sort of came from the floor up, and it came from an idea within the organization, and they felt it was a good bet and they laid against it, and it became a moneymaker for them. And I think that's the sort of approach you want. You want to have the opportunity for great ideas or the best ideas to thrive and come up. And then as the leader, you can determine, is that worth, X amount of risk? And essentially that's what leaders do every day. It's just that I think nowadays, again, back to the narrative, the world is changing so rapidly, so quickly. The demands on leadership are even more dynamic potentially in the past. And I think creative leadership, which is one of our hot topics nowadays, is the idea of how do you actually bring this skill set forward. And again, not to beat the generative AI drum, but that's going to drive a deepening, I think, of these skill sets, because the knowledge bases of these agents or these machines is going to be so staggering. Even if they're not always 100% accurate, they're going to be pretty damn good. And even in the worst case scenarios. So if that's going to handle all the X's and O's, if you like, your opportunity to then interact with these other humans and other machines is going to allow you to extend, layer in your experience, layer in your wisdom, layer in your insight and even intuition, and bring the best of the two worlds together. And I think that's where this whole thing's colliding in this next 10 years. It's going to be a massive uptake of creative expression driven by supported machine intelligence.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions I was going to key in on, is kind of where you see the future going. And a lot of it is, seems to be centered on how the demand for creativity and the evolution of AI is actually going to demand more, on that creativity side. And that's a big part, I think, is where you see the future of human performance, headed.
Yeah, I think creativity is one of the innate human characteristics that we bring to the table. I would layer in there compassion, empathy, intuition, courage. Those things that uniquely remain uniquely a human experience and sort of define us, I think, are going to be the opportunity sets and sort of the skills and things we bring to the conversation, given the knowledge base is going to be so strong in the machine platforms. And I think that's really exciting, because it means we're sort of trying to make humans more human, in many respects. So I think the future is going to be from my lens, is going to be very clearly driving a greater dependency on the innate human skill sets, which is almost full circle to when, a little bit before my time, back at the original, this sort of ancient models of sort of human characterization and civilization were sort of focusing on true human skill sets and characteristics. So sort of we've blown through this sort of tech age a little bit, and now we're back into let's make humans more human again. So we're coming from aspects.
Yeah, I think that so many good points in there about, not fearing that future or that AI, and actually embracing, the opportunity to be more human. Yeah, I think that's a real big piece to kind of this series is, there's a lot of biohacking out there, right? And really kind of the goal, I think, of our discussions is how do we help with leaders with leadership hacking, if you will, and kind of three take-home points, at least that I'm picking up on is one, how important it is to create space for creativity or physical health, right? And not just the physical time, that space, but also the space of KPIs. You mentioned the 90% failure rate with DARPA, right? The encouraging that space for creativity. I think the second piece is, how performance is integrated. It's holistic, right? It's not this isolated group of subparts, right? It's highly complex. And really the last piece is around this AI, and the irony that really the evolution of AI brings more humanity and more opportunity for even more humanity, because these more mundane tasks and data are going to be relieved and leaves more room for empathy, compassion, creativity, which I think are, those 3 points alone are certainly unique and opportunities for leaders to better kind of start adopting and learning, in what's becoming a very different world.
Yeah. And I think, and the point we're making earlier is that if you look at this sort of global work of human performance, and the narrative, what's driving a little bit of it for us is, I think, through the industrial age, through the technology age, whatever, the human was forced back in the day to be far more engaged in its daily environment on pretty much every level, from watching the weather and trying to plan the food to, not guaranteeing that everything was available, that you sort of could understand how we developed skills over the broader part of our evolution that really dug deeply into sort of, perception, awareness, intuition, presence, all these things that we hear talked about today. I think one of the wonderful things of technology is it's simplified all that for us. I saw heard a very interesting data point the other day about how the flattening of these systems, like using things like Google Maps or the GPS mapping on your phone, is reducing your inherent need to use your memory and working memory. And that's actually looking in this early data pointing to a reduction in some of the sort of cognitive demand on your system, which is in turn, you don't train your brain, it doesn't. So cognitive decline is sort of accelerating in those who don't. So what I'm probably trying to say to the audience is that there's this notion of, for all the beauty of all the advancements we've made, the human narrative is getting sort of, the traditional human intelligence is getting flattened. And here's the opportunity now to maybe re-engage some of these skill sets and develop it out. And I think that's really powerful. And from a leadership perspective, how do we bring the best out of our people on these truly innate human elements, knowing that they still have to do and engage on these other processes and systems? And for me, that's really the real opportunity moving forward as a leader. Is I got this human. Let's go back to the beginning of the human capital line item in my organization. What are those things that I can focus on that are not going to be duplicitous in terms of some of the machine or AI agents? And how do I accelerate that and give myself, again, competitive advantage? That's not about just doing it for the sake of it. It's how do I turn that into a winning combination for my organization?
Yeah, and that's certainly a key shared goal of all leaders, right? Is to win, right? And so a lot of this performance aspects are certainly for the betterment of mankind, but there's also rooted in that man wants to win, right?
Yeah, people want to win, and even people think the human nature is to evolve and grow, and down to our core genetics or evolutionary sort of development. It's sort of just what's next. If something happens to me, doesn't happen to you, I get to have a slightly better opportunity moving forward because of that change. And I think that whole narrative is caught up in the sort of human experience, and then we have to bring that to life. And not to say people haven't been doing it. I think lots of groups, lots of organizations have been, but I think now we can sort of look at it more as hey, this is almost a must-have versus a luxury. And in the context of everything you said, like, it's not for every part of the organization, it's not for everyone all the time. Maybe even, let's lean on our performance backgrounds. you're probably going to see periodization of these skill sets over a year, where you start to, in crisis, tax time, product launch, whatever it may be, everybody's heads down doing the job. At other times of the year, all right, let's open up the aperture to accelerate some of this broader thinking and creative thinking as we think about the next 4 or 5 years in the strategic planning process. So I think you're even going to start to see that sort of periodization of these skills. And as a leader, how do you flex across the organization, across your teams, and allow yourself to bring that up when it's necessary, and get the job done when you have to.
Yeah, that's hugely important, that awareness and that flex, the ability to flex, having that awareness.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the, you see great leaders everywhere. They have a toolkit of leadership styles. They have a core leadership philosophy that they've developed and anchored, and that's sort of the first part, because that's inherently who you are and how you show up. But you also have the ability to, become a little bit more of the let's get it done kind of approach, or you may have more of a creative, collaborative style approach, and they're not mutually exclusive again, but the best leaders have the ability to draw out across those different styles and bring them to the forefront, or have people that they are working with that bring them up, and they step aside and they follow and they let the others lead, and the ability just to create those different environments as demand dictates.
Well, Andy, thank you for your insights. Certainly, a very unique perspective, and one that I think is important as we continue to face uncertainty and change. So I really appreciate you joining us.
No, thank you. And I think it's a big puzzle, and I love listening to others and learning from others. So thanks to you for giving us a chance to share today, but also look forward to hearing from the rest of the community as you bring them to the table.
Absolutely.